Arnie, 1942, Chicago, Illinois.
Yes,
Let's
indeed.
go back. Just tell me, what was going on in Chicago when you were a little boy?
Well, there was a war on. There was a world war on going on at that time. My dad was away for part of that time when I was a young kid. We grew up on the west side of Chicago, which is where the Jewish community was sort of huddled at that time. And I had an opportunity to go to school on the west side for a number of years. At the time, we were living with my mother's parents. So I grew up with my mom and my dad and my younger sister and my grandma and grandpa.
Yeah.
And did that until I was about 7 or 8 years old. Then we finally moved out on our own.
Was your dad in the war, in World War II?
He was. He didn't deploy. He spent all of his time here in the States, actually. But he was in for a couple of years, I think from 42 to 45, I think, something like that.
Yeah. Now, what did your dad do for a living when you moved to Evanston?
My dad was always in sales.
Yeah,
Okay. He was in sales.
Tell me about your grandparents.
My grandparents are Eastern European, born in, and the country of origin depends upon what year they were born in, because it's called the Pale of Settlement in Eastern Europe. So it could have been Poland, it could have been Romania, it could have been Russia, but most of them were born in the Eastern European Pale of Settlement. Came here. In fact, my father was born in Russia as well. My father was born in a town in, I think it's called Zhytomyr in Russia as well. So I have Eastern European roots that go back a long way.
Right.
And what I remember most about my grandparents, because they were retired at the time when we lived there, was that they seemed to have a lot of time on their hands to sit and talk and visit and whatever. While we were always rushing off to school or doing homework or doing something like that, they were just always around and wanted to talk and visit.
Yeah. Did your dad ever talk about that trip coming to the United States?
My dad was 7 years old. I have a picture in my house of my dad when he's 6 years old with his parents, wearing a Russian garb and a big Russian hat, and his parents with the big Russian stuff like that. He talked very little about his background or experience. I don't think he remembered very much, because I think he was 6 or 7 when he came over here.
Yeah. Now, did you know your grandparents on your dad's side?
My grandmother passed away before I was born on my dad's side. I knew my dad's father a little bit. He was a little bit distant. We didn't live with that side of the family, and so I didn't see him as often. Didn't have a particularly close relationship with my dad's father.
So you never got to hear the stories about their travels to come here, what brought them here?
No. No.
Okay. And tell me about your mom.
I think about my mom in terms of not just my mom, but my mom and my dad. People ask me all the time why I'm a happy guy and stuff like that. I tell them because my folks were just basically happy folks. Plain, vanilla, uncomplicated. Be happy with what you have, not with what you don't have. So we were never folks with great means, but my dad always made a living. I always got a chance to go to camp, do what I wanted to do. There's always food on the table. And what I remember most of all about my mom and dad was it was just easy to live in their household.
Yeah. So you were a young kid, about 7, you said, when you moved to Evanston?
We moved north. We moved actually to Albany Park first.
Okay.
Albany Park, another Jewish community in Chicago area.
Yeah. Do you remember the elementary school you went to?
Of course I do. Hibbard School.
Yeah. What was life like at Hibbard?
Easy, uncomplicated. The most important thing was not to slide when you were playing baseball, because it was a gravel field. It wasn't a grass field. Those were the worries we had back then with that kind of stuff.
Do you remember Riverview?
Of course, Riverview Park. Sure.
High school.
The Bobs, which was the huge roller coaster, I think. Sure.
Yeah. And you get to stay on it with another dime. You didn't have to get off.
I think that's true.
Yeah. Well, tell me about the move to Evanston. What was that like for you? You're a young kid. You're giving up friendships, and you're.
Well, it wasn't that difficult. I don't think. We moved there 1959, 1960, I think. I didn't have too much difficulty making friends, Evanston Township. But at that point I was already thinking about what I was going to do after high school, and so a lot of that year was spent in college prep stuff and so on. I swam for the high school a little bit. Evanston had a very good swimming team. I was a competitive swimmer. So that's how I was able to make friends. And of course, back then we didn't know about the cliques, the geeks and the freaks and the straights and the socials, the ropers, the dopers, the goths, and so on. I was one of the jocks, I guess, back then.
Yeah. Now, growing up in the Chicago area, of course, with all the sport teams, were you interested in the...
Very much so, yeah.
Yeah.
We had a group of guys, we played basketball on a regular basis. We used to play at Eugene Field on Sunday morning and whenever we could. I didn't play for my high school team, but I played a lot of intramural basketball and stuff like that, touch football, all that kind of stuff.
Did you care about the pro teams at all?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I was always, I was a little bit of an outlier because actually I was a White Sox fan when I was younger. We lived north, and so most of the folks were Cub fans.
Yeah.
Of course, I was a Bears fan, Blackhawks, things like that. The only games I went to on a fairly regular basis were Cub games because they were close and they were on the north side. We didn't go to the White Sox games very often.
Now, in 1945 was the last time the Cubs were in a World Series. Do you remember that at all?
Do not.
You were 3.
Do not.
Yeah, okay.
I hear the stories, I hear the curse of the billy goat, I hear the Bartman stories, all that stuff, but no, that was all before my time.
Yeah.
Really.
Well, they're doing good this year.
They're doing very well this year, actually.
Yeah. So you're in Evanston, and you're thinking about life after high school and everything. So what are you thinking?
I'm not sure exactly what I'm thinking. I was an undergraduate. I was never interested in math and science. I was always interested in people. And people want to know, I'm a psychologist, people want to know how I got interested in psychology and family dynamics and things like that. And I tell them the story when I was maybe a freshman in college. I worked as a camp counselor at Camp Shy, one of the camps in Lake Delavan, Wisconsin Dells. And we had these kids, for 4 to 6 weeks of residential camping. And most of the kids got along fine, but there was always a few kids who were having difficulties or, scapegoated themselves and things like that, and so, but we worked it through. And then we decided to do something very unique. This is 1960 now, so think about that. It's a long time ago. We decided to do something when camp was over. We invited the parents to come up for a weekend, called it family camping. So the families would go on hay rides and make s'mores and things like that. Yeah. And so that was a fun experience. But all of a sudden, when I saw these kids who were already outliers already, then I saw them with their parents and engaged with their parents, a light bulb went on. I said, oh, now I understand why this young man is like this or why he does those kind of things. And I see the way the interaction between the parents. And I said, there's something about this stuff. Right. So that's when I particularly got interested in psychology, mental health, and that's really been my background.
Wow. So where did you go to college? Or did you go into the military after high school?
No. I went to the University of Illinois.
Okay.
Went there for 4 years. Followed the Fighting Illini. We had winning teams back then. Went to the Rose Bowl in 1963 while I was down there. Won the Rose Bowl. And then I graduated in 1964. This was during the beginning, of course, of the Vietnam stuff, and I had a low draft number. I got a deferment to go into graduate school. I went and did my graduate work up in Chicago. And then upon finishing up my graduate work, then I it's not drafted, it's called an OBV, an Obligatory Volunteer. That is, you can go in 2 years as a private first class, or you can go in 3 years as an officer. I said, count me in, I'll be a captain for 3 years.
Yeah. So how did that affect you as a young kid, knowing that you were going to have to go into the service? Did you feel like you were putting your life on hold? Was there a fear of Vietnam?
It wasn't so much about putting your life on hold. It was certainly the terror of combat in Vietnam, and that was a very ever-present concern. Even when I was on active duty, the solution seemed to be to just lay low, not make any waves, and not create any kind of visibility about yourself. Just do your job. Know your job, do your job. That's military lingo.
Now you were interested in psychology and everything. Did you read anything into, back then, the guys that were going off to Nam or guys that didn't want to be in the war? Were you seeing any comparisons?
Well, yeah, I think certainly it was a difficult time for our country. It was a time of great unrest. There was a lot of concern about our involvement in the war. There was a lot of protesting. College campuses were, very active with anti-war activity and things like that. And so I knew there was a lack of support, if you will, for the warrior as well as for the war. And I recall when I was in uniform, oftentimes I'd get scowled at, or occasionally people would call us baby killers and things like that because we were serving in the military.
Yeah.
In fact, I continue to work with veterans, to this day in my professional activity, and among the populations we have the most difficulty connecting up with is my generation of warriors, the Vietnam warriors, because they were never valued, they were never appreciated, they were never welcomed back home.
Yeah.
So one of the things that we're able to do now is with all of our OEF and OIF, which is Afghan and Iraqi veterans, as they get welcomed home, we are including now the Vietnam-era veterans, and they're getting thanked and welcomed home for the first time. And so we're starting to see more positive movement from that generation of warriors.
Now, your service, where were you stationed and what were you doing?
I was at William Beaumont Hospital in Fort Bliss in El Paso, Texas, and I was working almost exclusively with young recruits who were having difficulty readjusting, really adjusting to military life, and so we would provide brief solution-focused problem solving for them, help the commanders work with their difficult troops and things like that.
Yeah, yeah. Now, did you want to stay in Texas then after your service? Or?
Well, it's interesting because I grew up in the Chicago area and we were accustomed to Chicago winters, okay? Here I was in El Paso, Texas, and November came, and December and January I look up, the sun is shining, it's 70 degrees. I say, what's the deal here? He says, son, you're in Texas now. I said, these folks are on to something. And so at that point, I made a decision that at some point we would come back to the Southwest, if not to Texas, at least we'd be somewhere in the Southwest where it was warm most of the time.
Yeah.
So I left El Paso in 1969, did a postgraduate fellowship at the Menninger Foundation in Kansas on psychiatric treatment, if you will. And then I spent the next 6 years from there in Philadelphia as director of outpatient services of a community mental health center, part of a medical school in Philadelphia.
Now let's go back for a minute. What was it when you were a kid that you used to do that you would just die if you knew your parents found out?
I never smoked, so I wasn't smoking. Didn't cut school. Probably played doctor with the girls.
Yeah. Do you remember getting your first car?
Oh, sure. Sure, it was a Renault Dauphine. It was an old car, used car, and I remember it broke down on the Dan Ryan Expressway right after I got it, shortly after that, yeah.
Yeah. How much did you pay for that car?
Oh, probably $600 or something like that, I think.
Times have changed a little.
Indeed, indeed.
Tell me when you met Ellen.
I met Ellen as I was a junior at the University of Illinois. She was a freshman. Again, we were not a particularly wealthy family, and so I worked my way through college as a waiter. I was a waiter at a sorority house. Mm-hmm. And so we always got a chance to get the best cuts of meat. We always ate first before the girls, and then we'd serve 40, 50 gals. And Ellen was invited as a guest one night to be there in sorority. So I met her then, and I don't think I invited her out that time, but I think shortly thereafter I bumped into her somewhere on campus, invited her, we went out on a date, and that was sort of the beginning of our romance.
Yeah. When did you get married?
1966.
Okay, so was she out of college then at that point?
Yeah.
So you and Ellen get married, so where do you settle down and what are you doing?
Well, we got married in 66, and then we got invited to the United States government to come to William Beaumont Hospital in El Paso, Texas, Fort Bliss. So our first 3 years of marriage were as a young captain in the Medical Service Corps in the Army.
Yeah. Now, where was Ellen from?
Also Chicago, but she was a gal from the South Side, South Shore area.
Yeah.
In fact, it was very easy to date her when I was at the University of Illinois because, we lived near each other and it was real convenient. When we went home for spring break or summertime, I lived far north in Evanston, she lived in South Shore. I tell folks it was easier to marry her than to keep dating her, driving up and back from the south side to the north side, stuff like that.
So when you guys go down to Beaumont, was it a culture shock at all?
Yeah, it was. Two things, really. One was the military itself is a culture shock. It's a parallel universe. And the second thing, of course, is El Paso, Texas. It doesn't look anything like Chicago.
Right.
But the good news is we had a lot of friends, very close friends, because keep in mind the military is a very tight bonded universe. And specifically, I was friends with most of the other physician types, who were also in the same boat I was. They were not career military people. They just wanted to serve their 2 years. Most of them were drafted, or the Army had something called a Berry Plan, which allowed them to go finish their residency, but then in turn they owed the military 2 or 3 years, I think, as well. So that's where our friends, we had some very good close friends. We developed, things like book clubs and gourmet clubs and things like that in order to sort of bring a little bit of culture to the desert Southwest.
Yeah. What brought you to Dallas?
What brought me to Dallas was I was working as a director of outpatient services, community mental health in Philadelphia. And one day it rained, it snowed, it sleeted, and it hailed all in one day in Philadelphia. And I said to Ellen, you know, our kids were real little then. I think they were 5 and 2 or something like that. I said, remember those days we had fondly in Texas when the weather was great at this time of year? Why don't we think about going back to the Southwest? And so I made a decision to go back to the Southwest, and I put in resumes on half a dozen different cities, everywhere from Atlanta on the east to Albuquerque on the west and everything in between. I was just committed to coming to this part of the country. And I got an invitation to apply for a position here as a director of Jewish Family Service. Came down for the interview and was offered an opportunity to come down here. We moved our family down here in 1976.
Where were your kids born?
My kids were born in Philadelphia, both of them.
Okay, both born in Philadelphia.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, tell me about life with Jewish Family Services.
Jewish Family Service was one of the Federation constituent agencies, and so I was intimately involved in the Dallas Jewish community, and I was specifically recruited to help assist organizationally with the newest challenge that we were facing, which was basically the influx of Soviet Jews that were coming to America at that point. We had a comprehensive agency that offered counseling services, services to the elderly, adoption services, very active volunteer program, and several years later we integrated with and took over the vocational component as well. So we were a fairly comprehensive agency, offered a full range of clinical services.
How hard was that for you with these people coming here? Really, were they in need?
Well, one of the things I learned early on, it's a Chinese proverb, a good leader, when his job is done, the people will say, we did this ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I was driven by that view, and that is that there was a tremendous amount of work that needed to be done, and I was always of the opinion that these were not our Soviet Jews in terms of Jewish Family Service, but our Soviet Jews in terms of the Dallas Jewish community. We had to get it outside of the silo mentality that only this agency was responsible. And so we had a much broader approach in terms of involving other community organizations, agencies, tremendous number of volunteers, physicians, dentists. We had to recruit a tremendous range of folks, English as a second language teachers, things like that. So in many ways, the process of serving Soviet Jews helped our community find its own identity and build its own sense of accomplishment and feel good about what they were doing. I think we were not only building the Soviet community, we were building our own Dallas Jewish community in the process. I think that was a very important experience that we had for those 10 or 15 years. About everyone was involved, with a sort of a greater purpose to take care of a significant population. We as a community, and again, the Federation organizes its Dallas Jewish communities based on size of Jewish population. We were somewhere in the neighborhood of about 55,000, I think, something like that. And so we were considered an intermediate-sized community. We took more than our fair share of Soviet Jews as an intermediate-sized community because, one, our community wanted to, and I think partly was because there's a strong Eastern European flavor to the community, and so there's an identity with that population. But also, I think there was a lot of feel-good experiences about what we were doing to help serve that population. So I think we helped build our own community as well as the Soviet immigrant community in the process.
Very rewarding for yourself, I would think.
Tremendously so, in terms of having an impact on a significant part of American Jewish history is a resettlement. Of course, we are a nation of immigrants. My parents were, my father in particular was an immigrant from Eastern Europe, but our entire Jewish community in America was immigrants. We came from someplace else, whether it was, Spain and Morocco early on, or Germany in the 1850s, or Eastern Europe in the 1910, 1915 population. And then it was fairly quiet for a while, and then in the 50s and 60s there were a few more folks that came from Spain or whatever, a few from Cuba, but then the big push came from Eastern Europe in 1976 to 1985 or so. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet Jews were leaving there, allowed to leave. They were either going to Israel or some were coming to America, and those who were coming to America, we assisted in the resettlement process.
Yeah. Is there a story that you could tell us without breaking any confidentiality?
Oh, sure. I think the biggest challenge we had was the cultural differences. Growing up in the Soviet Union, which is a socialist country, very different than a free enterprise country like America. So it was not uncommon for us, again, keep in mind we had the responsibility for the full range of service, beginning with English as a second language. Without language, you had no opportunity to unlock the key to this culture. So we would encourage them to take the language classes. We'd encourage them to watch TV, specifically cartoons, which are tend to repetitive and fun and humor. They pick up language that way. Then after language would be some sort of employment. Oftentimes the employment would be, they would consider themselves underemployed because everybody thought they were a professional, and whatever in the Soviet Union. But more than anything, because it was a socialist state, we'd oftentimes have people come to our office, let's say a shoemaker, and he would complain to us that he doesn't have any business. And I said, well, you have to do good work and quality work, and people will talk about that. Well, he said, where I worked in the Soviet Union, I had a certain neighborhood. That was my responsibility to be a shoemaker for that neighborhood. Everybody was required to come to me as a shoemaker. That's the difference between socialism and free enterprise, if you will.
Yeah.
So
Interesting.
there are those kind of stories about that. They had no idea about American conveniences, so it was not uncommon for us to get a call from a landlord. Your Russians are trying to steam fish in a dishwasher. Things like that, So we had a lot of those kind of interesting stories.
Do you ever hear from some of the families?
Occasionally. I left 1992 to pursue other activities, but we occasionally bump into them, and it's really very rewarding to know that I had a part, our community had a part in sort of helping them get settled in this country and giving them an opportunity for the American dream once again.
Yeah. No, that's great. An invention in your lifetime, did something come along that you said, how did we ever get along without that?
How do we ever get along without that? Telephone. And one of the things that I've had to appreciate, specifically in terms of a management responsibility, is the different ways that we have to communicate. And that is, if they want to contact me or you, they'll use a landline and say, Arnie, are you available? Scott, are you available? If you want to talk to another generation, a younger generation, you would have to email them, and that's the way you would correspond with them. There's another generation, if you don't call them on the cell phone, they won't respond to anything. And there's still a younger generation, if you don't text them, you have no way of communicating with them. So it's sort of an appreciation about the different levels of how you have to communicate with people.
From a psychological standpoint, is this all healthy, the way people communicate now, by not talking to each other?
No, I think it's particularly unhealthy. I think it doesn't allow people to develop social skills, problem-solving skills, critical thinking. I think if you notice people are sitting down in restaurants and they're sitting there looking at their phones and they're texting, oftentimes they're texting each other and things like that. So I think they've lost the skill of conversation and of interaction and engagement and things like that. I think that's been a real consequence of the new technology.
Happiest time in your life?
Wherever I'm at the time. I really believe that. I've been blessed with good health. My family's been blessed with good health, and we just appreciate wherever we're at, whenever we're doing something. There have been very few bad times, with one exception. My wife had a very serious illness about 35 years ago that we were able to weather that. But apart from that, we've been very fortunate, happy. We travel a lot, and I love whatever I'm doing, wherever I'm at. As I mentioned, if you follow your passion, you never feel like you're working. You always feel like you're engaged in life, and that's how I felt I've lived my life. Passionate about what I do.
In your lifetime, you've lived through so many remarkable events, some good, some not so good. Of course, the Vietnam era that you talked about. President Kennedy assassination.
Indeed.
Something good, the moon landing in '69 for the first time, tragedy of 9/11. Was there something on the national scene that you remember and you go, I know exactly where I was the moment it happened?
Oh, there are many. Certainly I remember the JFK thing in '63 when I was a junior at the University of Illinois, and I remember that very specifically. The moon landing, I remember where I was at the moon landing. But I've also been fortunate to have some very unique experiences. I had a chance to work with the Defense Department for the last 15, 20 years, serving the military, and so I was at Hurricane Katrina. We're celebrating the 10-year, not celebrating, memorializing really the 10-year anniversary of the Hurricane Katrina. I was in the middle of Hurricane Katrina, assisting people in the dealing with the aftermath of the hurricane there. Just 6 months ago, I was involved with Presbyterian Hospital here, and I was dispatched on a crisis team to be there for the Ebola crisis. I was there for a month, and so those are sort of signature events that I've had a chance to do. So whether it's resettlement of Soviet Jews, whether it has to do with, working with the Ebola, working with the tragedy of the hurricanes, I've always had a chance to have these sort of unique sort of experiences.
You also do a lot of work with veterans.
Indeed, indeed.
What have you found from the, is there a difference in veterans from different wars?
Without question, without question. Tom Brokaw wrote a book, The Greatest Generation, which is the World War II folks. We never, as a country, asked much of them about their story. We were just grateful for them. There was tremendous amount of support. One of the things people don't understand and appreciate is that close to 10% of our nation was involved with the Second World War, whether it was actively involved, but everybody was involved in terms of making sacrifices, whether it was rationing sugar, coffee, gasoline, everyone participated in that. And that was very different than for our Vietnam-era warriors, where there was a great deal of dissent about whether we should be at war, not be at war. And indeed, what happened was that there was not a capacity of our nation to make a differentiation between the war and the warrior. So there was a lot of disdain expressed towards the warriors and a lot of unhappiness as a result of that. Fast forward now to our most recent experience, the last 10 years with Iraq and Afghanistan wars. There still may be some dissent about our engagement in the war, but there's no dissent about support for the warriors. Very, very different. There's a reservoir and a sea of goodwill that's out there in terms of caring for our veterans of the current generation.
Yeah, yeah. You and Ellen getting ready to celebrate your 50th anniversary.
We are indeed.
From the time we taped this. You have the 2 children together and 4 grandkids. Mm-hmm. What advice does Granddad have for the next generation?
I think the most important thing is to follow your passion in life. I think it's to be happy, but to provide service to others. I'm never happier than when I'm providing service to other people. Mm-hmm. I happen to be in a kind of profession that allows me to do that, where I can make people's lives better for one reason or another, and that gives me a tremendous amount of satisfaction. So if you can follow your passion, provide service to the community, I think that will bring you the kind of happiness much more than just material wealth.
Arnie, thanks for doing this today. You did a great job.
I appreciate it. Thanks.
Thank you very much.